Okay, so we all know the story, right? Adam, Eve, a beautiful garden, a piece of fruit they weren't supposed to eat, and of course, a talking serpent. It's one of those stories that's just baked into our culture. But what if the story we think we know is just the tip of the iceberg? What if, buried inside that familiar tale, there's a single verse that launches the biggest, most epic conflict you can imagine? And this is it. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Now, for centuries, this has had a fancy name, the proto-evangelium. It just means the first gospel. And the standard interpretation is pretty straightforward. You've probably heard it. This is the very first prophecy about Jesus, the seed of the woman, who will one day crush the head of Satan, the serpent. And look, that reading isn't wrong, but it is radically, fundamentally incomplete. It's like walking in on the last 10 minutes of an epic movie. You see the final heroic punch, but you have no idea who the villain is, why they're fighting, or what's at stake. We're missing the original context, the cosmic backdrop that an ancient reader would have just gotten. So let's dive in and get that context. To really get it, we have to kind of put on a different set of glasses. The ancient Israelites, and really everyone in their neighborhood, didn't see the spiritual world the way we do. They believed in something called the divine council. The idea was that God, the Most High, wasn't alone up there. He presided over a heavenly family, a council of other divine beings. Think of it like a celestial boardroom or a royal court. And this is the first huge key. Eden wasn't just a nice park. To the ancient mind, it was sacred space. It was God's HQ on earth, the place where heaven and earth met. And if it's the divine council chamber, then the presence of a divine being there isn't weird, it's expected. This also solves that question that always bugs people. Why wasn't Eve surprised by a talking animal? The answer is, she wasn't talking to an animal. She was in a divine throne room, talking to a divine being. Okay, so if the bad guy in this story isn't just a snake, then who or what are we dealing with? Well, the Hebrew word the Bible uses is Nachash, and if you just translate that as serpent, you're missing out on this incredible three-layered meaning that totally changes the identity of this character. First up, yes, as a noun, Nachash can mean serpent. But hang on. In the ancient world, serpentine imagery wasn't just about reptiles. It was a symbol of divine power and authority. I mean, the Bible itself describes these fiery serpentine beings called seraphim who fly around God's throne. So right away, the imagery is pointing us away from the zoo and towards the heavenly realm. Second, the word can also be a verb, and as a verb, nachash means to practice divination, to deceive with secret knowledge. And that's exactly what this character does, isn't it? He doesn't attack, he doesn't use force, he uses clever words, a deceptive oracle to make Eve question God. His very name describes his MO. And finally, this is the real kicker. As an adjective, Nachash can mean shining or luminous. Now think about it. What is the single most common characteristic of divine beings all throughout the Bible? They glow, they shine, they are beings of light. So this adjective is like a giant neon sign, pointing to this being's identity as a member of the divine council. So when you put all three layers together, the serpentine form, the deceptive method, and the shining appearance, the picture that emerges is unmistakable. The villain in the garden is not an animal. He is a shining, luminous, divine being who uses deception to stage a rebellion from right inside God's command center. And what's so cool is that the Bible itself seems to connect these dots for us in other places. You've got these famous passages in Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14 that often get read on their own. But when you put them side by side with Genesis 3, it's like you're seeing three different camera angles of the exact same event. All three describe a brilliant divine being in Eden, the mountain of God, whose pride and ambition lead to a rebellion. And in all three cases, the judgment is the same. Being cast down to the underworld, the realm of the dead. It's one unified story. So, armed with this new, true identity of the Nachash, we have to go back and reread God's judgment. Because these aren't just folksy explanations for why snakes slither. No, this is a sentence being handed down in a cosmic courtroom against a high-ranking traitor. Let's just compare the two readings. The traditional take, on your belly you will go, means snakes used to have legs. Okay. But the cosmic reading, going on your belly, is an ancient, well-known symbol of total humiliation and defeat. And you will eat dust? In the ancient world, that was a crystal-clear metaphor for death, for being sent to the dust of the underworld. Now, which one sounds more like a fitting punishment for a divine rebel? And that brings us right back to our verse.
The enmity God puts between them isn't about why people get startled by snakes in the grass. It is God's formal divine declaration of war, a multi-generational cosmic conflict between two opposing family lines, two seeds, the seed of the woman, humanity aligned with God, versus the seed of the Nachash, those aligned with the rebellion.
And once you get that key, that the whole Bible is the story of this war, everything changes. All these stories that might have seemed random and disconnected suddenly snap together. They become different battles in the same long-running war. Let me show you what I mean.
The war flares up again in Genesis 6 with the Nephilim as other divine rebels try to corrupt the human bloodline, the seed of the woman. It continues after the Tower of Babel, where Deuteronomy 32 tells us the nations are handed over to the rule of these same rebellious powers. Even Israel's conquest of Canaan isn't just about real estate. It's explicitly about wiping out the giant clans who are seen as the lingering physical seed of the enemy. It all builds and builds until the Messiah, the ultimate individual seed, arrives on the scene to take the fight to the enemy directly. And it all culminates in Revelation, with a final showdown against the dragon, that ancient serpent. It's one continuous story from start to finish. Now, you might be thinking, does seeing this huge cosmic war somehow make the Messiah's role smaller? Absolutely not. It does the exact opposite. It magnifies his victory beyond anything we could imagine, because now we finally understand the true scale of the war that he won.
The whole thing hinges on this brilliant Hebrew word for seed, zerah. It has this amazing dual meaning. It can mean a whole group of people, a collective, a corporate seed, like the nation of Israel. But it can also zoom all the way down to refer to one single specific descendant. The promise was always for both, a people and a person.
So what's the ultimate takeaway? The Messiah's victory wasn't just some private theological duel with one fallen angel. It was the decisive turning point of history below in a cosmic war against a vast, deeply entrenched supernatural rebellion. The glory of his victory is directly proportional to the size of that war. And the war was huge.
And here is the best part. This victory is not something we just watch from the cheap seats. The Apostle Paul, clearly thinking about Genesis 3:15, looks at the church in Rome and says, "The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet." The victory of the individual champion, the Messiah, is shared with his people, the corporate seed. We actually get to participate in his triumph.
So, Genesis 3:15, it's not a quiet, gentle promise. It's the starting gun for a war that defines all of history. What began as a rebellious whisper in a sacred garden exploded into a cosmic conflict between two lineages, two competing visions for all of creation. And that brings the conflict right down to us, today. It really leaves just one question, doesn't it? Which seed story are we living in?